Hey there, Workforce. Chris here with Work2Game, and I am actually going to be doing kind of like a community feedback based on some Reddit posts that are being responded to by Brenon Holmes, the creative director over at Bioware. So let's get started. So the first comment is Darth Maddox saying, is there any way possible that you could have this game in third and or first person gameplay as a switchable option? There are a lot of first person players that just don't get into the third person shooters. Even a chance? And Brenon Holmes says, unfortunately can't talk much about that stuff yet, but as we get into the marketing campaign, I think it'll become fairly apparent how it works and could work. Now this kind of beats around the bush, but it's an interesting question from the standpoint of it's a big question with communities like PUBG, because a third-person shooter gives inherent advantages that they can look around the corner, but first-person shooters is its own skill set, and so when you take that information away, a different group of players climbs to the top, and I can't wait to see which way this comes out as we get closer. Now with the release date looking like it's been pushed out, we don't know exactly when those marketing campaigns will start. The next question is cross-platform gameplay, and Brenon says there generally aren't a lot of technical reasons why this couldn't happen, which is what everybody seems to be saying in this thread and everywhere else on the internet. It has more to do with what terms we are able to negotiate the various platforms are willing to allow, though also, as some are also suggesting, there are sometimes design reasons why you might not want to allow the mixing of PC and console, mainly due to differences in hardware. And honestly, that's usually dealing with performance as you move into competitive play. When you want to talk about competitive play, consoles do a beautiful job of mostly leveling that playing field, although that's starting to get a little less, a little muddier now that you talk about there being Xbox One players all the way up against Xbox One X's, and then the S's being in between. That there is kind of that inherent unfair advantage. I load into Call of Duty maps faster than my brother. So a lot of times Call of Duty matches start before everybody's all the way in the game, and so on games that are objective based, I get 30 seconds more to get to the objective than he does sometimes, and that's just not fair. So that way's starting to go away, and like Brenon said here, it's just up to what can be negotiated. Sometimes PlayStation doesn't want to let you play nice with Xbox. So if you're going to be on PlayStation, you're not going to be over there. And then you have to kind of make these calls. And that could go either way. That's just my example. So we never know exactly which negotiation is causing a game not to be cross-platform. Now the next part's a bit of a conversation where people are worried about the toxic loot box economies coming into Anthem. And Brenon Holmes says he hears you, and they're taking a fair bit to kind of think about this at the moment. They can't talk about it yet, but it's an ongoing discussion. And if it helps, we're all gamers too. A bunch of folks on the teams have similar positions on monetization, so that perspective is definitely represented. And he says, well, what is the worst form of monetization you've seen? Well, I think it has more to do with the philosophy around it. The first thing that most people do is look at the value of the sweat currency as opposed to the premium currency. Personally, I prefer games where the ratio is somewhat reasonable. In example, I can reasonably acquire currencies to purchase things through regular play. Personally, I don't like it when some things are only available through premium purchase. And that is a good thing to hear from their creative director, and hopefully is percolating through their entire organization. As long as it's done towards just cosmetics, things I don't need, and that it maybe is a shortcut to something that is reasonably achievable. Say you can unlock 2 different forms of characters, but you can only play one at a time. And you unlock one after maybe 4 hours of play, and another after 10 hours of play. Well, you might be able to buy them both immediately. Well, 4 hours is not that long to have to play a game before you get something, especially an RPG. And 10 hours is not that long since you're now already enjoying the first thing. So now you've got the first 4 hours, and then you've got another 4 hours of it, and then maybe you have to go back and do a little bit of whichever ends up being your favorite. Now you're there. That's reasonable. The issue is when you have this pay-to-win mentality, or this, I'm going to shave weeks or months or years off. And so as long as they can avoid that, I think he's absolutely right. It is a philosophy thing. And the next thing is there going to be some sort of clan system? Well, please allow for big clans or guilds. I manage a group of 400 plus Australian, New Zealand gamers in the Destiny community, and to a lesser extent, Warframe, and on and on and on. If I'm being greedy, having a base that can be expanded and worked on together would be amazing. Oof, that's a lot of people to try to coordinate. I'll bring it up for discussion. That's a great response that he's hearing you, but it would be totally reasonable for them not to carry that. It's awesome that there are groups out there that big, but to say that all needs to be native, there are so many games out there that don't even have a native way that's good to manage just your immediate friends. So I don't really know, but that's an interesting standpoint. What does the social side of Anthem need to look like? What do you guys think about that? Looks like lead animator Stephen Gilmore left Bioware. I'm pretty sure we'll be fine without it. They don't owe us an explanation for why somebody doesn't work there anymore. That's not something we're really entitled to. That's somebody else's life and livelihood you're asking about. Let them keep it private. With no set release date and hundreds of people working on the game, it's going to be fine. One person leaving is something that happens a lot. Let's not jump to conclusion. Sometimes people want to move on after 17 years. Brenon says, to be fair, I can understand the sentiment. There's not really a lot that goes on out there in the public domain, so it's natural to be curious about what's going on. I won't go into why Steve left. That's his business. I'll note that he had previously retired from games some time ago and came back to help on an unannounced project. Don't get excited. This was a bunch of years back. And now we have a different lead animator. You know, as he noted, it's always sad to see a colleague leave. Hope this improves. Yes. It is a huge thing, and I think it's wonderful that people do track these individuals a lot like you would a lead director for movies or something like that. It's what can give you a lot of feel for like the context and texture and emotion that's going to go into developing a game. And so if you like the way a particular either critic writes reviews or a particular lead animator animates games or a creative director heads up things or a level designer, then that's awesome to kind of follow them and through their career and say, wow, I really respect what they do as their form of their art. And I want to see more of that. So it'll always, you know, if it's somebody I know, that'll always lend me some credibility when you talk about things like picking up a game that hasn't been hugely reviewed, when you talk about things like pre-orders, which 2017 really burned us on. These are things we look at. So seeing somebody leave is something to be aware of, but it's not something necessarily to be terrified of. People leave. It happens. It could be, I want to retire. It could be, I want to find something that gives me more time with my family, or I got a great offer. You don't leave a job because you don't like that job anymore. I hope none of you are in that position where you feel that has to happen. That's an awful place to be in. You can feel helpless. You leave a job because something better comes along. So that doesn't mean that what you're in couldn't be great. You know, Steve Gilmore could have loved it at Bioware. We don't know, and it's none of our business, really. But he could have been offered a position somewhere else that's even better. And that position doesn't have to be in gaming. That position could be being a new dad or a new grandfather. That position could be a buddy opened up a tackle shop off a river that we always fish together. I'm going to go open it with him. It's all relative to his priorities, just like yours should be to you. And it's not necessarily a concern that, you know, my last company that I left wasn't working for me as an employment, but that doesn't mean that they don't do great things and that their customers should be overly concerned. Definitely aware of. If you see a trend of people leaving, or if you find out that people are leaving because of very specific reasons, and the people who are replacing them are actually kind of the opposite of that. So if he's leaving and you're seeing the game take a shift in a new direction, that's something to be aware of, but it's not something necessarily to be afraid of. What is everybody's thoughts and expectations when Bioware stated that Anthem is a dynamic open world? Well, maybe the events change seasons like the open world or the main hub. Say it's a holiday. Maybe you could have main hubs be more festive, taking it to an extreme. Maybe world starts to accumulate snow. Interestingly, it's technology we have. It's unclear whether we'll ship with it or not, but the graphics guys have done some pretty amazing stuff with snow accumulation. Basically, we can accumulate snow on surfaces over time. It looks pretty cool. That said, we're a bit more tropical now, so it may not make as much sense to have this kind of thing, but it's still pretty neat. I'd love it if we could show it off. It's a pretty neat bit of tech. Maybe water accumulation instead, tropical storms and all that. There is actually some subtle water accumulation. It's pretty relaxing to just hang out and watch puddles form. This is something that's really exciting about how games have become more immersive. And, you know, as graphics cards and everything becomes more powerful, one of the benefits is not just that games can have higher resolutions, but it's that, like, when I'm playing shooter games now, sometimes there's like a can that rolls across the ground, so your eyes aren't trained to just look for movement like they would have back on the N64. There are things that move just to move. And so it's a lot more immersive. As long as they're balancing this, hopefully, with things getting easier, right? Less load screens, things like that. Those are all things that we want, we crave. Something like Zelda, where it's truly open world, and you can just go and go and go for these enormous distances. That's what an open world, in my mind, has always been defined as, that we could never picture ourselves experiencing. Zelda, in my mind, is the best open world RPG that I have ever played. The new one on the Switch, hands down. And that is something that I didn't know that that's what open world meant to me until I experienced it, until I was in it. And I was like, yes, this is what I've been thinking of. And I have a feeling based on their sales numbers that a lot of people felt that way about Zelda. So hopefully that's what it is here, and that they're able to take these things and make the world beautiful, make you want to experience it. And like in some of his other posts that he said, I don't want people to go back to town because they have to. I don't want us to put in forced mechanics that are that blatant, but I want people to go back to town because they want to, right? Something you're excited to do. And an immersive world can be a big part of that. With what's been going on with Bungie and fan feedback about communication, maybe we should establish what we would like to see from Bioware in terms of communication. Hope you guys have had a great holiday. I have a quick question. Assuming Bioware will be using some type of API system with Anthem, will this be available to the public in order to provide third-party functionality to the game? If I'm not mistaken, Bioware had first-party application that would take your Mass Effect Andromeda multiplayer information, allow you to run strike teams, modify equipment, respec characters, and buy items at the store. This is a lot to unpack here. So with the top of the thread being about communication, Bungie did something really impressive in that I think they came out with a planned release schedule on content that they delivered above and beyond up until things started to go south. And the communication was almost weekly. There was a couple weeks that they missed here and there, or it was really light, but the communication felt there until you realized that it wasn't so much a phone call as a video, if that makes sense, where it was just this broadcast, and so it felt like they were talking to you and you were talking back. But it's like those voicemails where somebody does that, hey, it's me. What? I can't hear you. Oh, you missed me. Leave a message, and they're messing with you, and you're filling in those blanks. That's what Bungie did from my perspective. They were talking to us, and because they were saying the things we wanted to hear, we assumed they could hear us talking back. And then what we wanted shifted, and their train of thought just kept going for a little bit. And that's where we separated. And by the time we realized that we needed to be on the same page, there was this huge gap to cover, and people got really upset. And so how is this going to be different? How do we set this? And this is a very healthy way of looking at it. It's a lot like a marriage, right? You should set these terms of communication now, right? So, hey, how are we going to resolve disputes? I want to talk about this now while there's not a dispute, because that's what gives us somewhere to come back to, instead of waiting until we're all upset with each other and then being like, hey, let's talk about this reasonably. Well, no, screw you. You talk about it reasonably. So I think that's a fair question. And then saying that one of the ways they want that communication to take place is an API, something we're interested in doing. There's a lot of investigation. They can't confirm anything. They can, however, tell us, well, it's something we're interested in doing, and I think that doing it in a balanced way makes sense. And as long as that isn't just a politically correct way of stating it and then never coming back and acknowledging we don't find it functional right now, or we do find it functional right now, I think that's a fair statement for now. It goes on to say, with lead time for patch approval from MS Sony, a test environment for consoles is not likely to be something that would be feasible without mass resource consumption, speaking from experience. You're not wrong. A large part of it depends on the frequency of patching, though, wouldn't it? If, for example, we were to be doing monthly patches, we could deploy to a test environment 1 to 2 weeks before shipping. End users would then see a patch every 5 to 6 weeks. Maybe that's fast enough. I should note, I'm not including all the other ways we could have for updating games outside of traditional patches, hotfix, live updates, etc. A lot of this is just with the logistics when you're locking in your fixes. Yes, there are probably some challenges to figure out, but I think we're still interested in it. A test environment is something really interesting when you talk about RPGs, in my opinion. You have things like test servers where you can have these top-end guilds will go over there and they can learn boss strats. And then the final boss or whatever won't be exposed there. Which inherently means that boss isn't balanced, but it also inherently leaves it spoiler-free. And so you can have people that kind of get this jump on the first 1 to 2 raid bosses or whatever. And that kind of ruins part of the game, doesn't it? Like, to say that that's... Now you already see, if there's going to be a new mechanic that's a theme for the new dungeon, if they want to balance it, then they have to expose it. If they don't expose it, they can't balance it. So regardless of frequency or how it's implemented, I think balancing is something that test environments both make a ton of sense for and absolutely don't make sense for. People have a tendency of using any advantage they have, whether it's unfair or not. It's why insider trading is illegal. So if we want to make a change to rocket launchers in a first-person shooter, and we make that change in the test environment, you're going to see people over here immediately already acting like that change has been implemented. So say they're making SMGs better in its place, they're immediately going to be starting to use SMG more to try to get used to the gameplay as much as possible, so that when the patch goes live, they're already a step ahead of everybody else. So I don't really know how often they should patch. I don't know if there should be a test server up, and I don't know how that works. In my mind, what I don't want is something like what Warframe has, where PC is noticeably ahead of console. I understand why that exists, and that's not a dig on Warframe, but I think long term they should work to close that gap, if not remove it altogether. Dynamic difficulty adjustment in EA. Could you provide a little more information on what the post-release monetization strategy will be? As I'm sure you're aware of, people are anxious about this because we really want this game to be everything it looks like, not just an unrealistic hype, but the game that we know Bioware is capable of making. Unfortunately, that's on the list of things I can't really talk about right now. I definitely understand the anxiety about what potential plans may be, but I can't provide any clarity. Sorry. Makes sense. Can you say, as much as its current place in the discussion will be similar to something we've seen before, or they might be trying something new? Any kind of impression you could provide, regardless of that impression, actually carrying information in or not, would be something that we could talk about while we wait for more details. A lot of this stuff is under discussion even as I speak, so we still wouldn't be in a position to provide any clarity. Sorry. I think that anytime we start to talk about post-release changes to the game, whether that be monetization or content schedules or how they're going to scale, the difficulty of acquiring items, the difficulty of beating current content, what role premium currency will play in that, they're going to play that pretty close to the chest. I'll keep covering these comments as they come out in case there's something there, but this was pretty clever response on Brenon's part in that it doesn't tell us anything, and I think it's very fair of him to hold that close to his chest. It's been a couple weeks, hasn't really changed as far as I know. Seems like they honestly couldn't answer us even if they wanted to, because if they answered us now, they would be obligated for that to be truth or to explain to us why it's not. And they shouldn't have to do that. If they think that there's a reason that something could be done better than what they feel today, and they want to make that change, we should never be the wiser. We should just get the new and better version at release of the launch, right? What can developers do to earn the trust of a very nervous fan base? Destiny 1 supposedly cost Activision less than $140 million to make and generated them more than $500 million in the first day it released. Remember that those $140 million were spent over 5 years, meaning Activision spent this $140 over half a decade, making 4 times that money in a single day. When we talk about budgets, Brenon links to another article. There's a ton of articles out there about this. When we talk about budgets, there's something to be really aware of when you talk about running a gaming company. And the keyword there being on company, not on gaming. Regardless of your industry, you have a fixed amount of money. Regardless of anything, you personally have a fixed amount of money. It doesn't matter if you're Jeff Bezos and that fixed amount of money is enormous or not. There is still a finite amount of money that you have. And that money can only be doing so many things at once. A lot like time. We all have been given the same amount of time every day that we're alive, and we use it however we use it. And so when you choose to put time and money into a project over the course of 5 or 10 years, what you expect to get back is not just that. If I ask you to borrow $100 because we're good friends, and you give it to me, and I wait 5 years, and then I give you back $100 and say we're even, we're not even, because that $100 could have been doing all sorts of other things for you, and every minute of your life that you spent asking me about that $100 over 5 years is a waste of your time. And so I owe you more than that. I owe you communication along the way. I owe you a ton of things. And so saying that they made $500 million in their very first day, well, they may have had 10 game ideas and they had to try to pick the best one. How do we not know that there was another game that would have cost 140 that would have made 600? In which case, there's somewhere some accountant in their office that says we lost $100 million, right? So it's all about what makes the most money, what generates the highest profit. And you do that not so that you can be greedy from the standpoint of, oh, well, we're making 4 times profit on every single game. You do that because you're not always right. You're just not. EA comes out with titles every single year that we don't pay attention to that lose big, and they can spend $100 million on those and they can generate nothing. You see it the same thing in movies. You have these things that are just box office flops, and so they have to make their money up when they can, and then they have to save that money or they go under. They have to have money to invest, right? So they put that 140, that's spent. So not only could that money have been using interest if it had been in traditional investments that whole time, but it also is money that they now have to pay back because that money was spent, which means if they make, let's say even just 200 million, they've got 60 million. Well, that 60 million has to go towards the next game. So you always want to have enough money, and as game development costs have skyrocketed over the last decade. So it may cost 140 over the last 5 years, but the next game may cost 210 million. So you have to have made enough that you not only made your money back. If you had 140 to start, you spent 140, you made 140, the next one cost 210, you can't afford to finish the next game. So you have to constantly be in front of it. I think there are a ton of interesting conversations we could have on just this topic alone, but what developers can do to earn the trust of a very nervous fan base, and then us immediately pivoting to talking about money and saying they made too much and it's their fault, is a disconnect. Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 being good or bad games had nothing to do with how much money was spent. It had nothing to do with how much money was made, right? I paid the amount I paid for my copy. It doesn't matter how many other people bought copies. I paid my copy, and that was an exchange with the developers for the effort they put in. And it doesn't really make a difference that everybody else wanted to show up. It only matters what that content meant to me. And the next guy, it only matters what that content meant to him. So just because 200 of us show up to an event doesn't make that event any more or less responsible on an individual level than if only I had showed up to that event. And I think us focusing on money is a valid conversation to have, but it needs to be very separate from the term trust. If somebody wants to become the richest game company in the world, but they want to do it by consistently releasing the best games ever made, I do not care. You can become the richest company to ever exist. Just give me the best games ever made at a cost that I agree to pay. That's it. So if $60 is the industry standard, and you can give me the best game possible for $60, time in and time out, I will continue to pay you every single time. Yeah. Next comment, I guess. Will this game be true open world? I don't want to get into the comment mining and all this. Well, sorry, that was a general comment on streaming, not necessarily what we're doing. We do have limitations on flight. Long story short, this comment is one of many comments asking things about flight mechanics, load screens, what is the definition of open world, and that is a fair question all on its own. They do have limitations on flights, but they want you to have a sense of freedom, right? Both left and right. And basically, somebody goes on to say, you know, it's ever-changing. Yeah, basically, the trick is to hide visually all the stuff you want to load in and load out. So in an open world, you may go into a giant canyon. As you move through it, you unload the world behind you. A bit later, you load the game in front of you. You see this a lot with tight corridors in cities. As you round a tight corner, there may be what feels like an alley that doesn't have anything in it, no vendors or anything. And what you're doing is you're allowing that entire big section over there to unload, and you're allowing this entire section in front of you to load. And in that city, maybe there's no mounts allowed, which means that they can guarantee the amount of time that you're going to be running down that. And so they kind of force that load time. What is the definition of open world? If you see a load screen ever, is it open world? I don't know. Because Destiny, you went out to the ship and then you fly planet to planet. And so it's not really an open world. It's a series of very large levels. World of Warcraft, on the other hand, you can go over an entire continent. And yes, there's multiple continents now as the game has lasted forever. But you can cover huge distances flying. Is that the definition of an open world? Is anything less than that? Final Fantasy is a series of connected zones. Is that open world? It's kind of open world. The load screens are relatively short. And so when you start to talk about things like the ability to instance zones, especially as you start to put more population on servers, will this game be a true open world? I don't know that that matters as long as it's fun. So if you can keep your load times at a minimum and you can keep them in a distance that we don't notice them, more power to you. But if you can't, well, you know, there are limitations on what things can happen. So since they're going to give us jetpacks, I can see there being a real problem with letting us just hit full blast and going forever in one direction. I don't know. What do you guys think? I love this next comment because Brenon Holmes has done such a good job pushing all story-related questions off to the future to not spoil anything. But somebody asks, where do you think this game's setting is? And somebody says, I would have said Earth, future. But since we got a sneak peek, it could be everywhere, but still the future, obviously. And Brenon Holmes responds with, not Earth. And I thought that was so funny. So definitely not on Earth. That is awesome. Next question was about verticality in Anthem and the freedom of flight. Brenon has responded about this question in a way. Unfortunately, his answers will be limited until we're told more about the game. Here's what he said so far. I mentioned it in another thread, which I think we kind of talked about a little bit, to assure a sense of freedom. But the reason I added this comment is actually this next part. There will be some amount of progression and skill expression with flying. It'll affect how far you can go and what you can do in the air. There's also limits to how high you can go. We're playing with a flight ceiling prototype right now. It's fairly subtle. Feels more like a heavy downdraft. We'll have to see about specific height limitations. It's all kind of up in the air. Nice pun. Right now, it's mostly dependent on performance. There obviously has to be a limit somewhere. They can't just let you fly forever. But it is interesting that they're starting to explore kind of what are those distances, not only in the distance of load zones like we just talked about, but height, depth, what is that overall world, right? And does it vary by zone? Does it vary by type? Does it vary by population? I don't know. And those are all questions in that I think as long as the game is fun, we won't notice. And that's such a dodgy way to answer that. Like, well, as long as I like it. There's a comedian, Gary Goldman, that talks about how much pulp we like in our orange juice, and that we all got mad that there was pulp, and so then we went no pulp, and now we're like, well, I want some pulp. And they're like, well, how much is some pulp? And it's like, well, we'll tell you when we're happy with the amount of pulp. That's kind of how we feel about freedom in a video game. What is the amount of freedom that we want? Well, we'll tell you when it's, you know, well, you made the game too free, now it's not fun. There's not enough objective, there's not enough, you know, you had to restrict too many other things because you're trying to worry about performance. You should have made it more chopped up into zones so I could get more of the game that I liked. Okay, well now you chopped it up too much. You should have made it more open. I don't know. We kind of put them in a hard spot, and we'll tell them when they get it right. And the next one is crafting system in Anthem. If we had a crafting system in Anthem, wink wink, what kind of things would you like to see? Now, I want to follow this up immediately with the next comment. In another thread, you responded to a Reddit user who asked about the game's ammo, economy, and management. You not only described what types of methods you used for players to resupply, but you wanted the Anthem community's ideas on how we would like to see ammo resupply work. My first question is, has the team made any headway on this particular system? My second question is, did any of the ideas brought up by Reddit users within that topic give you tangible ideas to work with when solving the problem? I'm only asking because I believe you mentioned in at one point that one method you originally tried wasn't well received. And they said, well, they've narrowed it down a bit more, but we're still doing a lot of playtesting and evaluation before we really lock it down. The ideas brought up were useful, mostly to gear the kind of things that people are interested in. It was more like having another voice at the table, if that makes sense. When it comes to prototypes and evaluation, we usually like to let things soak for a while to make sure we get a full and fair evaluation of features. This is an awesome level of communication, and I think if 2017 taught us anything, it's that when gamers are upset, we can get upset enough on a broad enough basis that companies have to hear us. And so hopefully, like, I don't want to have to yell at you every time to get you to listen. Like, that would be awesome if we could get to that point before gaming companies in general. So it's nice to see them having these ideas. I don't know how that conversation works when you talk about a game that sells even 1 million copies, right? 1 million people is a lot of opinions to gauge, especially because people say things like, it would be fun to be like super powerful. But what we found is that when you make a game where everybody's just super overpowered, they get bored with it and they give up because there's nothing worth earning. And so you have to pick through the mess and say, well, who's worth listening to and who's worth not, and how do we do something that everybody's going to like, which may or may not be something in the comments. It may be something new and different. That's why we pay them to be the developers, and we ourselves are not developers. I like putting my junior developer hat on all the time and speculating at things I'd like to see in games. But I don't have to bet my livelihood on whether or not that idea pans out the way I picture it in my head, and whether the general population as a whole likes it as much as I think I would maybe if it was done right. So that's kind of my thoughts. This was all the way up to 9 hours ago with what Brenon Holmes has responded to people on Reddit. I've pulled through a ton of his comments, so this is not even close to all of them. I really like seeing people officially from Bioware go out and engage with the community as much as they're allowed to. It means a lot to me as a gamer that they're willing to go out and do that. It's not a guarantee. Like I said, I saw a ton of communication from Destiny, and Destiny kind of burned us hard last year. But I dig it. I do. And I appreciate it, Bioware. So, is there anything you guys want added to that? Is there anything you guys feel that kind of cleared up? I would love to know in the comments below. I would love to kind of keep this conversation going as we slowly build hype for Anthem. It is far from a release date that we can plan on. And I would love to know kind of what you guys think we'll get to see between now and then. What do you think we'll even know going into E3 in June, right? So we've got kind of 4 or 5 months, whatever that distance is. I can't do math. What are we going to learn between then, and what do you think we'll see at that? Do you think we'll have a beta announced at that event? I don't know. Would love to hear from you guys down below. This is Chris with Work2Game. Thank you guys so much for hanging out, and I will see you next time.
Hey, it's me. I'm in Chris's office. He doesn't know it, but we've got other videos for you to check out right here. And we've got the vlog down there in the corner. Plus, we've got some contact information, and you can totally subscribe to the channel that way as well. So we hope you do. We hope to see you in our next video, but until then, take care.